Welcome to another episode of our series on effective teaching and learning. My name is Kwadwo and Kwesi, and we continue with our series, the portion where we're looking at direct instruction. We've had 3 episodes so far. In the last episode, we recapped the key elements of direct instruction. We said that direct instruction encompasses having a learning intention or objective, having a success criteria, having a starter, having a presentation, having a guided practice for the students to do after your presentation, giving the students the opportunity to do independent practice, and then also having a closure, what is also called a plenary. And in the last episode, when we look at success criteria, we said it is that key element that defines for the students how their success will look like, what the key things they will have to consider to be able to tell for themselves that whatever they set out to learn, they have been able to achieve them. And then we also said that the learning objective or learning intention need to be captured in what the learners need to know, what they need to understand, and what they need to do. And that it is very imperative that we delineate the context for the learning objective. If I'm learning to follow instructions, it should be that at the end of the lesson, I will be able to write or follow set instructions. However, not I'll be able to follow instructions to make sandwich. Because if you end it up by saying you be able to follow the instruction to make a sandwich, the learners are going to be tempted to believe that the teacher taught us only how to make sandwich, and that in any other context in which questions will be framed, they will say, my teacher never taught me so. And so we ended on that footnote and said that it's very important that make sure that your success criteria is following the objective set such that the students at each objective they learn will be able to follow that objective with the success criteria and achieve the sectors. In today's session, we're going to focus on what we call the starter and then the plenary. Starters and plenary. In the last episode, we mentioned that starters and plenaries are the gateway to start and have interesting introduction to a lesson. And they are also the ending of that lesson, and which needs to be done in such a way that they captivate and then summarizes whatever learners have done. We would like to explore what starters and plenaries are in this session. We would also look at what makes them effective and also look at how we plan for them. Then also we'll look at how do we manage and organize them, because planning and not knowing how to manage and organize them will not lead to the starter or plenary being effective. And then finally, we will look at how do we use them in their content areas. How can we use starters and plenaries? As usual, I am Kwadwo and I'm here with my colleague, Kwesi. Kwesi, how are you?
Kwadwo, I'm doing good.
It's welcoming to always see you on the other side and for us to continue our discussion to ensure that in the end, we have teachers and educators doing what we do and then ensuring that we do it in effective manner. Before we get started, what would you say is a major problem that we face in education?
All right, thanks for the question. That is captured in a starter for this activity, but we asking students are engaged in meaningful learning when normally when students are trying to understand a material, make sense out of it. Normally when students are questioning the information that they are receiving, it helps them to get engaged in meaningful learning. So if students can also relate what they know to their previous or established experiences, it helps them to get engaged. So this tells you that engagement in learning is a key thing for a number of students. But if you look at the research of Michael Fulland and his colleagues, They discovered that, and Jenkins in 2013 discovered that a number of students, especially those who are entering a secondary education, really are disengaged in their classroom. When they ask teachers about, various teachers of different grade levels as to what really engages young people in school, the percentage of students that are engaged in learning really was on a very dramatic downward decline. And if you look at the statistics, they realize that students are engaged in the lower years, early grades, about 85% of them. But when you move to, let's say, our JSS or lower secondary level or secondary education, only 37% were found to be engaged. And even when the question was posed to students through a Gallup survey, uh, it was realized that even the percentage of engagement, or let me put it that way, disengagement is very high when students are entering secondary education. And they discovered that only 32% of students in, let's say, upper secondary, the first year of upper secondary, really said that they were engaged in learning in school. So Michael Fulland speaks to the heart of it, that what young people need in today's school most is engagement and connection with their learning and with the adults that teaches them, right? So it tells us that any meaningful learning experience that educators design, we need to really look at the tools that really will bring an active engagement and connection with the content. And we using starters and plenaries in the context of highly interactive direct instruction or explicit teaching does engage students in a constructive, meaningful learning experience. And I think that is what our discussion really pretty much focus on. And we will show educators how they can use the starter and a plenary to really engage their students in learning, especially if they are in the handling students who are in the upper primary or upper secondary or lower secondary levels.
Thank you very much for laying it out. That it's very, very helpful to have such a background because I believe for most educated, they see that there's a lot of refrain, a lot of nodding head, a lot of disengagement, even on the faces of students as they go through their teaching process. And sometimes, even before you do your assessment, you can tell this child never followed whatever we were doing. And
Mm,
so it is very important that we know that the major issue here is engagement, and
yeah.
the concept of starters and plenary gives us a solution to the issue of engagement. But what would you say is a starter? And if you can link up with the follow-up, which will be what is a plenary?
All right. So starters and plenaries basically are the starting and the ending learning activities. Learning activities. The actual instructional time, which where the teacher is teaching and then giving students learning tasks to do, is a key part of the learning or instructional time. But the starting and the ending of the lesson itself needs to have very clearly defined or carefully designed learning activities to engage students at the start and also at the end, provide opportunities to direct students to reflect on their learning. So if you look at a startup broadly, as I said, it is supposed to exploit the initial or the prime learning time with the purpose of connecting students with their prior learning or the new learning which they are about to engage. So this starts at the beginning of the lesson and it shouldn't last more than 5 minutes. Bear in mind the concentration span of the learners that you're dealing with. So starters can be used, for example, to find out what students already know or find out what skills they already have that is useful, or knowledge they already have that is useful for the new learning, or it can be used to practice a skill that students have mastered or they have been exposed or taught. And you can also use that to mobilize students' knowledge and understanding and abilities to help other students with their learning as a way of reviewing previous learning, or enabling or preparing students for the current or the new learning that is available to them. But starters have to be carefully designed with a clear purpose, and it has to be linked to the overall objective of the lesson, which defines the objective, which defines what students are learning. And what is also key here is that the starter should allow the student, gives the students opportunity to demonstrate their own learning without any interruptions. It's a very key aspect of it when we are administering it. So unlike the starter, the plenary happens at the end of the lesson, as I said earlier on, and it helps the learner to focus on what they have learned, the progress they made in the lesson, and then determining their next step through reflection. And this should happen not only at the end of the lesson, but it certainly has to happen at the end of the lesson. But it can also happen throughout the lesson after an objective, a learning objective, has been achieved by the learners. Then a plenary is useful at that strategic moment of learning, but it should always be featured at the end of a lesson. And it's a plenary that enables the students through reflection to demonstrate what they have learned, how they are learning, and also to articulate their own learning and to understand themselves as learning and be able to communicate that or express that, right? Uh, like the starter, the plenary also have to be planned carefully as part of the overall learning episodes of the lessons. And again, it should be linked to the learning objective and the success criteria, which enables students to recognize how they will be successful with their learning. So that is what I would say about plenary. Plenary happens at the end, starters happens at the beginning, uh, but they are learning tasks that students engage in at the beginning to review what they know and to prepare themselves for what is ahead, which is the new learning, and the plenary at the end to reflect on how well they've been learning, what worked for them, what they have been learning, what they have been mastering, and the gaps in their learning, uh, and what they need to do in order to move towards achieving the learning intentions. So that is what the starter and the plenary
So it's
does in the lesson.
stressing that they are learning activities. And
Yes.
why that? Why were you constantly stressing that the starter is a learning activity, the
Yeah.
plenary is a learning activity, and they ought to be planned? Why that
Yes.
stress?
Yes, it's because of what is happening in Ghana now. In our first episode, we touched a lot about that. We were happy as Edu Transform, providing professional learning for educators to ensure that every child experience meaningful learning. We are concerned about how the new standard-based curriculum is being developed. Even though we are happy with the structure of the lesson plan, that it should have a starter, it should have the main learning activity, and it should have the plenary section. But from the media, the examples of starters that we've seen more is linking to students singing, kind of, which we would describe as movement breaks, to really get students kill boredom and get students in the mood of learning. But starters have a clear link, and it flows from the research of Phillips 2007, who tried to look at certain activities that teachers can give or work that teachers can give students at the beginning of the lesson, and how that helps the students with their learning throughout the lesson, right? So he was using a number of stimulants to check how that can enable students to be engaged and be committed to their learning. And this thing doesn't happen spontaneously. It has to be carefully planned because there are key episodes of the lesson and they should have a clear purpose, like I said, either to review, a starter to review a previous learning which is relevant to the new learning, or to review a skill or knowledge students have, which might be relevant for their current learning. And the plenary section is to review what has happened, how the students make progress. And I think in our conversation, we're going to look at certain practical examples of it, what teachers can actually use in their content area to deliver meaningful learning always for every child.
Another key thing I noticed from your presentation so far is you keep stressing that unlike starters, which have a definite who's placed in the lesson at the start, the
Yeah.
plenary should be at the end, but should not just be at the end, but in other places also.
Yes.
Why do you say that too?
Yes, because you know the plenary is supposed to help students articulate their learning, demonstrate their learning, right? So once a learning objective has been achieved, so you're teaching a lesson, it has 2 or 3 learning objectives. The first objective has been achieved, right? You have to review that to see whether who is learning, who is making progress, what is the next step. So the plenary is a very important diagnostic tool, right? For students to reflect on their learning, to see progress they're making, and to see the gaps that are in their learning and determine the next steps of their learning. Okay, and that is why it's so important that it should happen overall at the end of the lesson. But once an learning objective has been achieved, students have to be given the opportunity to reflect on their learning.
Okay. Thank you very much for that clarity on the area of where the starter is and where the plenary is, and the reason why we need to have what I would term mini plenaries, because
Yeah.
if I'm seen by my objective, then at the end of where I know these objectives have been covered, then I need to have a plenary where I review and find out who has been learning, who has not gotten whatever we are doing, so that I don't leave any of my students behind. What makes
Exactly.
starters or plenaries effective?
All right, there are basically 3 things that
Okay.
uh, we need to prioritize when we are looking at the plenaries and status, effective plenaries and status. There are 3 things. The first thing is that this learning activity should engage all the students, all the learners at the same time, right? So if it is a starter, if it's a plenary, there are that kind of learning activities that should engage all learners, not some, all. That's one first key characteristic. The second is that it should establish pace. You know, pacing a lesson is very important, right? The plenary and the starter, if it is carefully designed, then it should enable effective pacing of the lesson to optimize overall learning of the lesson content for students. And then the third thing is that it should provide challenge for students. So let me just pick one of them, one of each of them, and then expand on it a little bit. Uh, the starter or the plenary, there are those activities, as I said, that student needs to get it done quickly and get everybody on task quickly. So for a starter, immediately students enter the geography lesson, the science lesson, the literacy lesson, the first learning moment should be a starter, which you have an activity available for students to do. Whether they are in the early learning center, once students walk into your classroom, there should be a starter. It is that activity that should engage the student. It should challenge them immediately. So they don't have to walk into your class and find nothing doing, right? That is what,
Waiting for the teacher to tell them what to do. It should be
exactly.
something that it
No,
readily gets them going on a task.
exactly. So the
Okay.
starter activity is immediately there, and the student should, it should be a routine. It's best when it's a routine. The students should come to realize that immediately we enter the space, there is a task for me to do. That is the starter. And then before I exit the building or I exit the room, there is a task for me to do. That is a plenary, right? And this should engage all students. But one key thing here about the engagement is that the tasks that we design for starter or plenary should not go beyond the concentration span of the learner. And we've said from research that it's +1, +2, or -1, -2 of your children's age, right? But specifically, if we have to say legislated, we'll say that the starter should not go beyond 5 minutes, and the plenary should at least be 10 minutes. The last plenary, the one that is at the end of the lesson, it is very important, right? And that these are things that it should be immediately accessible to all the learners, right? It should be immediately accessible because these are things that they are supposed to do immediately by everyone. So accessibility is very important. It being available, and that the design of these tasks should factor the students' interests in mind. So using things like mystery, curiosity, being novel, and being relevant to the learner is very important in making sure that the students are engaged. And it has to have a clear expectation for the learners as what the task is about. But what is key here is that when we talk about engagement, it's an emotional thing, not only cognitive or behavioral, but it's also emotional. So it's important that the learning environment should be an environment that gives students or challenge students. At the same time, it should be an environment that is low stress. Because when students are stressed, they don't have positive energy to engage in meaningful learning. So for example, if a teacher has you given a homework and the teacher starts his lesson with collecting homeworks and getting on the nerves of students who have not been able to complete it, I mean, you set yourself for a bad day for learning, not for yourself alone, but for the learners. And that is why the starter should be, the homework can be delayed and later the teacher can collect it instead of collecting it at the beginning or at the end of the lesson. It's preferred that it's collected midway in the lesson than in between because homework are high stress tasks for a number of students, especially those who lack the requisite skills or knowledge to do the work who normally do not submit them, right? So one key environment for the starter and the plenary to work is that student needs high levels of challenge in the task, but it also has to be a positive emotional environment for the students to strive. So this is very important when we talk about engagement. But with pacing, which is also one key element of an effective starter or plenary, when we talk about pacing, we are not just talking about quickly moving from one episode to the other in a lesson, but we are talking about moving the learning forward more purposefully, right? And how do you do that? You make the, you have to make the starter, the plenary, quickly accessible, like we've said, to the learners. You need to set the clear expectations within a given time frame. We're given 5 minutes, 10 minutes for plenary, 5 minutes for starters. Set that clear expectations for the student. And then the teacher needs to interfere. If it is 5 minutes for starter and it has ended, you need to move on, right? You need to move the learning forward. That's where you interfere. And you have to module what is required in effectively executing or doing the starter or the plenary. So these four things are very important for engagement, but it's also very important in helping the teacher to move the learning forward purposefully, which is pacing. The second element is the element of challenge. You see, the brain is designed for learning,
Yes.
right? So if we are designing a starter activity, it should give the student that initial mental warm-up for that deep and wonderful learning that the teacher has prepared for them. And if that is the case, then a starter should demand active engagement and higher level of thinking. And that is why we have a challenge with the numerous singing or songs that have been used as starters within the Ghanaian context with reference to the introduction of the new curriculum, right? But when we talk about the element of challenge, it shouldn't be too easy, which will create boredom. The learning task, the starter or the plenary, it should not be too easy. Neither should it be too hard that will cause frustrations and demotivate students, right? So the key thing here, I'm sure you're asking yourself, is what is a useful module, right? In making sure that the starter or the plenary that is designed for the lesson really creates challenge for students. I mean, I think the Bloom's taxonomy is a better or useful module for building challenge into a lesson, whether it be in a starter, a plenary, or the key learning activity. And with the Bloom's taxonomy, you can look at the 6 levels in 3 ways. The first level is about knowledge, getting to know, comprehending what you are getting to know, and then using what you know now for something, right? So we need to design tasks that have testing these 3 skills. And then tasks that are higher level, where students can look at the parts of a given concept and see how they are linked. They are able to synthesize, also bringing things together to see the big picture, and also judging significance of things, which is evaluative tasks. So analysis, synthesizing, and evaluative tasks combined with the low-level tasks of knowing, comprehending, and applying. If we have this tool, then we can design starters that is not too easy, that is not too hard, or plenaries that are not too easy, not too hard, but they are just right for the thinking levels of students, and that can bring engagement and the element of challenge, and ensuring that the lesson pays effectively to enable students enjoy and engage themselves in meaningful learning always. We keep saying meaningful learning always because that is our passion in EduTransform, that will work with educators to create a classroom space that really provide that kind of learning experience for students all the time.
So we've mentioned that the key considerations for what makes a starter or a plenary effective is if it has challenge in it,
Yeah,
if there is engagement, and then
mm-hmm.
also if there's space in it, there's spacing.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
like the
space.
fact that you mentioned that engagement need not just be cognitive, but
Yeah,
engagement should also be emotional,
yeah,
such that I am present with you in terms of how I feel about it. And that if it is too hard for me, I
mm-hmm.
will not feel so good about it and I will be disengaged.
Yeah,
And if it is too easy for me, I will find it so easy that I will just get it done in no time and rather find something else that will amuse me. And
yeah,
so, as a teacher, as an educator, you need to plan this by taking into consideration that you need all the 6 key um, Bloom's taxonomy in there together to build for yourself challenge into the lesson, and also make sure that in the for your starter or plenary, and also make sure that the students are paced right. And pacing is making sure that you are moving not so fast, you're also moving not too slow. And
too
so
slow.
it is something that you need to always gauge your learners and find out what is it that will push them so that they are going a bit faster, so that they are also not too slow. But if we can move on to the examples, I
Okay.
know contests and plenaries, we have seen so many examples.
Yeah,
I don't want to even go back to the era of seeing a lot of singing around, and then
yeah,
everyone singing any refrain, any chorus, and then saying it is a starter.
yeah,
We don't need to even start on that tangent, because I believe from what you just said, it is not just singing a chorus or singing the popular refrain that makes it a starter, because if it is not planned and it's not an activity that focuses on the teaching and learning that is going to happen per that
mm,
moment, then we cannot conclude that that is a starter. So can
yeah.
you give us some examples of starters that we can use in the classroom?
All right. So we will have some few examples here, which actually comes from the work of my gift Sean. But
Yeah.
there are several of them that you can actually Google a starter for your subject, and you can get tons of ideas about some of these starters. And I want to share just a few of them. This is an example of a starter. I mean, picking out the odd one out, right? So you've taught the concept. You can bring all the key elements, classifications of things, and then
This
all
can be
that.
used in seeking an RPK of what I've taught previously.
Exactly, exactly, right. So, or you can even test them to
Yeah.
see what
What they know about
they
it.
know about what you are going to teach them. So you
Yeah.
can come up with 2 or 3, 4 items and ask the students to pick. And this is just a one task on the board, and every child is engaged and is trying to find the answer to this,
They are not
right?
waiting for the teacher to tell them what they're
Exactly, exactly.
right
So
from
the
the
idea,
beginning. They have this.
perfect. So like we said, we will talk about how you plan and do all of that, but I think we can mention that in here that it's something that can be on the board, for example. This question can just be on the board. And while the students are tricking in or you are transitioning from one subject to the other, you are telling the students to answer this question on the board, right? So just picking the odd one out is one example. Another example here is, what is a question? You give the answer and you ask the students, what is the question? So
Okay.
if this is the answer, then what is the question? So an example is the willingness and the ability of a consumer to buy a specific quantity of a given uh, product at a given within a given period of time is what? Is the concept of demand. I think I skipped some words there. Buy a specific quantity of a product at a given price within a period of time. So the students will then give the question and not the answer. So the teacher gives the answer and say, if this is the answer, what is the question? Another example, which is very popular, is show me the answer. Show me the answer. And you will need a little bit of resource to do this. And you know, when we go to school and we're writing notes, the old Formica board that we
The
normally
Kahoot
use.
board. The Kahoot
Exactly,
board when I was in school.
exactly. So teachers can have that, or you can just have an A4 sheets like, and then laminate it, right? That students can write the answer so that everybody can show the answer at a go. Or if you don't have any resource at all, at least you have exercise or notebook. So you can ask your students to just pick one sheet of it, right? And write in big letters, their responses, and then show the answer. The idea of this is to see everyone's thinking at the same time, right?
Okay.
By you and by the student, right? And that can generate a lot of discussions and conversation about what they have learned already or what they're about to learn, which the starter purpose for them to review. Okay, so that is one. Another example. Another example is, what is this? You can display anything that has relevance to what you are going to learn, the students are going to learn, or what they have already been exposed to. So you can show maybe a structure of the digestive system or the nervous system. You can show a photo of an area, a diagram that is relevant to the content you're teaching, and ask the student a simple question, what is this? And everybody write their responses. And then there's a moment for review and feedback, all within the 5 minutes
Another
that
way
we
this can
talked
be
about.
done is if you don't have the benefit of technology or
Yes,
LED TVs and all that,
yeah,
it's a matter of having a picture that has been you take from a magazine or your textbook, wherever it is, and then paste it on your board and ask the students, what is this?
what
So
is
that
that?
you don't have to have technology as a barrier to what
Yeah,
you can. And if you have the benefit of having cardboards in your class or in your school, you could have had these things drawn largely on the cardboards and have them displayed in the class so that the students, when they enter or when they are transitioning into the lesson, can quickly look at it, and then there's an inscription on top of it. What is this?
Yeah.
And then they start thinking about it.
Yeah. So it's good that we're thinking about more ways of doing this, even with fewer resources, to encourage educators not to just throw in the towel because they have not access to technology, a projector, or a TV screen in their classroom, or access to a laptop. But I think whichever place you are and whatever resource you have, like you talked about a cardboard, an A4 sheet, a photo in a newspaper, in the magazine, as you mentioned, from the internet, at least you can print a copy if you can, that is relevant to what the students are learning. And you can just show that to them and ask them to write their responses on what they think about what they are seeing. So that is what this starter looks like. So another way, which I think you can do without doesn't require much of a resource per se, which is what would you like to ask? So you are teaching a concept to student. Okay, so for example, I deal with economics. So if you have demand on the board, what would you like to ask about the question demand? What would you like to ask about verbs, about nouns? What would you like to ask about fractions? What would you like to ask about adding two-digit numbers, subtracting two-digit numbers? So this is an opportunity for you to know what is in the minds of the students concerning what they are learning or what they're about to learn. And then you actually then have the opportunity through the I do point session where you are teaching to really provide the answers to the questions that are in your students' mind. And in the plenary, they can actually review that these are my questions. I think they have been answered, and that I think that I'm making progress as far as this particular objective was concerned. So this is something that any teacher can do in any subject area. What questions would you like to ask? Just encouraging students to be curious and asking the relevant questions. And you can help them by using the 5W and an H, what, the where, the how, the why, and then the H, the how, questions that are starting with such a prompt. And students can generate a number of questions about a particular concept.
That strategy again. So if I'm using that strategy in identifying what I want to ask, I need to ask a W question.
Yes.
So an H question.
An H question. So I was saying about the 5 W's and 1 H. So the why, the when, the what, the where questions, those kinds of questions, and then the how, which has to do with steps or processes, how things are done, kinds of questions. So you can start with the what and how, for example, and the why. What is a living?
When do we say this is a living thing? Where are living things found? And how are different living things different from non-living things? So there are questions on my mind about the concept of living things.
Exactly. So these are things that teachers can actually give students.
Have that framework for the students, for them to ask those questions.
Exactly.
Whilst they are waiting for the lesson to start.
And then they, within the review session of the starter, they can then share these questions, and then the teacher will know what is in the minds of the students, so that whilst you are delivering the instruction, you'll bear in mind the questions that students have and make sure that the instruction is relevant to them in answering them, by answering the questions that they have. Relevance is very important for engagement, and that is something that we've touched on. So if you know what is in their minds, the questions they have, then you teach them in such a way to answer their questions. And by answering their questions, learning will happen. And you can have the opportunity of reviewing that at the end of the lesson. Another thing is instructions. Most of the things that we learn has to do with processes, right? So we can ask students, they are learning how to add two-digit numbers. You've shown them how to do it and all right, but you can also ask the students to write an instruction on how to perform that specific task.
Yeah.
Okay. Instead of writing a narrative essay, you can ask the students to write an instruction on how to write an effective narrative essay, or to give an effective narrative of any issue that has been posed to them, right? So they write instruction about how to perform the task, not just performing the task. And that can be a useful starter that you give students. Another thing here is that you can use a web.
What do you know?
Yes. So you can write a concept in or the phrase, and then ask students to write everything that they know about it, right? So here is also a way of reviewing to know what people know in the classroom. It's a very quick way of, at a glance, to know what students know and what they don't know. So somebody might write about 2, 4, 5 things about verbs or nouns. Somebody might only have one item about, or he or she knows about nouns or verbs or adjectives if they're dealing with a parts of speech within a literacy lesson, right? So once the students do all of that, it gives you the teacher opportunity to know their gaps in their learning and how you can fill in even as you teach them. Okay.
Before you go to plenaries, let's dwell back a little bit on the status.
Okay.
I didn't see you mention singing and and all those things. What
Yeah.
are you deliberately taking out the possibility that I can have my students sing to or recite, chant, some those things, are they totally not acceptable, or it has to do with how I will use them, or what is it
Eh,
for?
I mean, like I refer to Philip's research. Singing was one of the things that he actually looked at. Music, if I should put it that way, was one of the things that he used. But it has to have relevance with
Okay.
what the students have learned or what
Okay.
they're about to learn. Okay. So if I look at some of the songs that are being used as starters, reference to implementation of the standard-based curriculum in Ghana, I'm asking myself, what relevance does it have to do with studying fractions? What relevance does it have to do with uh, trying to understand how Ghana obtained its independence in a lesson like that? So those are the things that you have to look at, because if you look at the examples of status that we've given, it has relevance to the content area that the students are engaged with, right? So if you're using music or songs, it has to have relevance, right? So people have songs about the water cycle. People have songs, and these days, if you check the net, you can have several songs about even adjectives, about verbs, about nouns. And if you are singing now or living things and non-living things, and all the content
I
that we,
remember I learned about the days of the number of days in the month through a rhyme, and it's
yeah,
still in my mind.
yeah,
30 days of September, April, June, November, all the rest, those things. And it was when we were going to learn about dates, calendars, and all those things in
uh,
mathematics that we had to sing that. So
uh,
there,
espe-
you have to make a case for the relevance of whatever you are doing before you get the students to do that. Other than that, just singing any song at all, and especially these popular commercial songs about products in the market space, does not
yeah,
really make sense, because it has to
exactly,
be relevant to what the students are learning, but not just
yeah.
to have fun singing something. All right. Can we look
Yeah.
at plenaries
And
then?
I mean, examples of the songs that you gave, that's what the early year teachers, the preschoolers,
Yeah.
teachers, they normally use that in teaching the
Yeah.
numbers, in teaching the days of the week, the months in uh, the names of the months in the year, and all of that. And they keep chanting that at the beginning of every lesson, so that students can really remember and get familiar with the numbers and the alphabets that they need to master. So this starter and plenary needs to contribute and direct the overall learning that the students are actually going to engage in that 30, 40, or an hour lesson or more that has been designed for them.
All right. Thank you, Kwesi. Are there any plenaries that we can also use in the classroom?
Right. So the closure is very important. When you are ending the lesson, how you end it is important. I show by our descriptions of an effective explicit instruction or direct instruction, we are encouraging teachers to exit from the practice where they'll be talking and talking and talking, and then they realize that it's time and they give the students homework or continue the next lesson. That is not instruction, right? That is not direct instruction. And that is the bad practices that people speak about negatively when they talk about direct instructional module of learning or pedagogical approach. But we've talked about the 7 components, and we believe that those that are following the conversation are incorporating them in their instruction and they are making learning meaningful for their students. So as we said, the plenary happens partway through the lesson after an objective has been met. And also at the end of the lesson, there should be a time for students to pause and reflect and articulate their learning and understand themselves also as learners. So it's a reflective time. And these questions can be used. Again, we make reference to my Gibson's material, which we put them in the slides, and you can look at the source and be able to access more materials that he has for very effective instructional practices in our class. So this is one thing that we can also do. One example of a plenary. What do you know now that you did not know at the start of our conversation about direct instruction? That's a plenary. So what did you know now that you did not know at the start of our lessons about nouns in a literacy lesson?
It's a
Another
very
example.
example where the child is pushed to think about his learning for the period that you spend time with him or her.
Exactly. Another one is what is the most important thing that you have learned today, and why is it most important? So you state what is most important thing you've learned today, as we talked about starters and plenary, and express, give a reason why that is most important. Right. Another example is what do you want to know as a result of what we have learned today? Based on our conversation about starters and plenaries, what do you want to know as a result of what we have just uh, taught you about? And then the other question that we can use for plenary is what questions do you have based on today's discussions on plenaries and starters? So what questions do you have? So we can ask the students, what questions do you have based on today's lessons on nouns? Today, I seems to be on the parts of speech, the nouns and the adjectives and the verbs. All right. So it seems to fill the examples that I'm using. So what questions do you have? And certainly students have questions that they have about what they are learning. And the plenary gives them the opportunity to raise them. And then another one is, in what ways might you use your learning from today's lesson in the future? I remember I did a lesson on the terms of trade, and I asked students this particular question. And it was interesting what they wanted to use that knowledge, that understanding about terms of trade in taking decisions uh, uh, as policymakers. And I was enthused about it. So
Wow.
you
At
can,
that
yeah, it's at that level, yeah. So you can actually give students opportunity to think broadly and in terms of seeing the relevance of what they've learned to everyday living and existence, right? Uh, Another example is based on what we have learned today. What do you think we should study next? So that is something that, and why? So we talk about the module of direct instruction. So we can ask our participants, and that is a question we can pose to you. That based on what we've talked about today or learned about status and plenary, what can you predict will be the next thing that we'll be studying and why? Another example, how might you explain what you have learned today to your parents? So you are teaching students how to calculate the mean, how to find the mode how to find a median. You can ask the students, the math teachers, they are more into just dealing with the mechanical aspects of learning.
Let me go brief for them on this because I
As a,
know my math teacher will ask you, how would you explain how to do this to your junior brother who is yet to get to class 2 or class 1, even in
exactly.
those, so that they get you to think about the processes that you go through to get this done.
Yeah. And
Some
when
math
you're
teachers,
doing this too, when you're doing this, you're also in building writing,
okay,
right, in your content area. And that is something that we can all do. It shouldn't just be the language educators that are responsible in building and improving students' writing. Right. So if a math teacher is not just giving works that students can calculate, but is also asking them to explain what they have learned to their junior brothers or to a friend, or phone a brother or a friend and explain what you have learned today about simultaneous equations, about algebraic expressions, and all of those things that they are studying in the classroom, or to their parents. This is a good example that we can also use for reflection at the end of a lesson. What connections can you make between today's learning and what we have previously studied? So we've talked about status and plenary. What connections can you make about status and plenaries with the last episode on learning objectives and the
yeah,
success criteria? Okay. How have you worked today? See, the working is the learning. I mean, the way the child is solving the questions, the way the child was trying to answer the essay response that was given to him or her, even the coloring that was given to the child, the alphabet that was given to the child to shade in between the lines and not across it. How has the child been able to do this? So even the coloring, it involves the proper holding of the crayon. And that is something that a child needs to learn, because he needs to know how to hold the pencil or the crayon or the pen properly. And it starts with the crayon or the pencil that an early childhood student needs to master, right? And why? So these are conversations that students can have about what they are doing in the classroom and why uh, that knowledge is relevant to their success within that space. We can ask about what skills have you used during this lesson, right? So talking, communicating, listening, these are all skills. Aside the skills of calculating or computing, the skills of writing that are being required more in our lessons, as far all those analytical skills, the evaluative skills, there are so many skills that students use when they are responding to the tasks that we give them. And it's important that we ask students to reflect. And this is a very important question, because I normally ask even adults what skills they have, and they find it very difficult articulating them, right? So the skills are the abilities that you have that enables you to do something. And we need to teach students that they have, even those that we say are struggling, are not doing well, there are skills that they have and that they use in their learning every day in the lessons. And we need to get them reflect on that. Another example could be, how might you improve your learning next in the next lesson? What skills have you improved in this lesson, and how have you improved them? This is one thing that I love. Students have a lot of creativity.
yeah,
Some can draw, some can uh, rap or sing, some can do so many things. So we can have a plenary that enables them to use. Remember, we said that the plenary or the starter should be interest based. Right? So if the student likes singing, likes writing, is a very wonderful artist, you can ask the students to paint instead of sing what they have learned. You can ask the students to draw a portrait of their learning today. Or if they like singing, you can ask them to sing. You can even ask them to write a poem or a short story about what they have learned today, if they like to write. right? So use the students' interests, their strengths, to get them reflect on their learning. That's an example with the same strength-based approach. Create a poster advertising today's learning to other students. So these are all examples of plenaries that we can actually incorporate in whatever learning area that we find ourselves in.
It's very interesting the way those who are in the movie industry will do it when they are producing a series,
Exactly.
where before you watch your next episode, they will give you something that will hook you so that the next time you will still come and watch that. And then
Perfect.
when they are ending, they will give you a summary of what has been done. And so, in addition to the examples you shared,
Yeah.
asking the students to give a 3-minute summary or a 3-sentence summary of what they have learned today can be a plenary also. Asking the students to give a news in brief
Yeah.
about what they have learned today can also
Yeah.
be a plenary. And
Plenary. Yeah.
it means that for us as educators, it is not just a matter of just saying, okay, today we've ended the lesson, I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Or just take this and go home and do it. Without properly getting the student to reflect and then also share what they have learned in the process. So that in the end, you can be sure for yourself that my learners after my sessions with you have been able to do A, B, C, or E. And that
Yeah.
is why we've been saying that starters and plenaries are two of the most crucial portions for every teaching moment. And that if you lose the opportunity to use them, definitely you've really lost a big chance to help your learners develop so well. Now,
Yeah.
Rachel, let's look at planning for starters. Are there some key considerations that any tips I need to have as I'm planning to have to use a starter or a plenary?
All right. So I think we've established that it's important that if you are teaching effectively, you would teach with a plan starter
Yeah.
and a plenary. And that at the end of the lesson, it's important to reflect on the usefulness of these plan starters that were incorporated to direct the learning for your students. So in order to do it well, in order to plan it well, there are certain key considerations, as you asked, that the educator needs to pay attention to. One of it is that we need to ask what the key aspects of learning that we wish that the starter or the plenary needs to address. Okay, so like we've given the example that for starters, I mean, its key purpose is for students to connect their learning with their prior learning, connect with the new learning. So whatever you want them to practice, to find out, uh, whatever information you want them to mobilize so that it can be useful to other students' learning, if that is a clear purpose, you really have to define that before you choose any of the example activities that we've given and the many other activities that are available that you can actually use as a starter activity. So once you decide that you want the students, this is the purpose, then you choose the device or the activity or the channel by which that purpose is going to be realized. So is it the odd one out, or is it give a 3-minute press statement like you were giving an example for plenary about your learning today? Okay, so you then choose the appropriate activity, and then the purpose of the plenary or the starter should be linked to the learning objectives. That is very key. So you don't just select any starter, but that starter, the purpose of it, it should have a link to what students are going to learn in their current lesson. And then once that is established, you need to determine the duration. At what time will it happen and for how long? So starters, as we said, is it exploits the prime learning moment, the initial time through when students are transitioning from one subject to the other, and when they are entering the lesson in a secondary class where students are moving, when they are entering the lesson, that is a prime learning moment, right? Instead of saying, keep quiet, settle down, put a starter on the board and get a student's attention on it and get them working. And that will organize the class immediately for you. So you need to determine when it will take place and for how long. And we've suggested that for starters, it should be 5 minutes. For the plenary, at the end of a lesson, at least you should devote a 10-minute session for that deep reflection on the learning. But whenever an objective is achieved, it's important that it's reviewed through a plenary. And once these considerations have been factored in the design of the starter activity or the plenary activity, then the teacher has to prepare for it, right? How am I going to manage it? Okay. How am I going to prepare and manage the starter activity so that it doesn't become distractive, but it's actually going to be that a low moment for every child in that class, because we've said the starter and the plenary should engage all the students at the same time, right? And so how are you going to prepare for that? And what resources are you going to need? And I think whilst we're talking about examples, we were suggestive of some of the resources that teachers can use in the design and the administering of starters and plenaries in their classrooms. So that is a key aspects of the planning that you need to think about.
It's so instructive. I'm just reflecting on myself also that I can see that you don't just go in and say, okay, they will do this. You
Yeah,
need to
no.
carefully plan what they will do and why they will do it and when they will do that. Because I have had my personal experience of I have been a math teacher, a math science teacher. So
Yeah.
having used games in lessons has been one thing that I discovered along the way to be very, very engaging for the students. Sometimes when I put a game at the starter, they get so interested in it, they will not want to stop. But unfortunately, when it gets to the end and I'm doing some assessment, then I realize that there was no link, there was no clear purpose. So what they do on paper for me, so that it was just fun, having fun, they could not connect the content with the game that was played. And so it's very important as educators, not just to pick anything at all and say, we'll do that. Having the students just screaming and shouting in the class does not necessarily mean that they are engaged. And so I would say right from there that I failed to get my students engaged. Although if I had any other person pass by my class, they say, wow, that was a creative thing I saw this teacher do. But in the end, it didn't give me the results that I wanted. And so it is something that we all need to reflect on. How about organizing? How do I organize to ensure that my starters are effective in the classroom? Because like you are saying, I have to make sure that all of them are carried on. It's not an easy thing to do as a teacher.
Yeah.
So that all your learners are carried with you, and then you don't have time overruns. You get them to be focusing on the learning that comes with whatever you are doing. How do I go about doing the managing and organization of the starter and plenary?
All right. So in managing and organizing it, we just need to look at these three things. The classroom where the learning is going to happen, the students or the pupils or the learners who are actually going to engage in this starters or plenary activity, as well as we've talked about, the resources that needs to go with them. When it comes to the classroom, you need to think about the layout of the classroom. Where will the starter activity be? Are you going to have it on a piece of paper? Are you going to have students sit in a circle, or they are with the pandemic, they are all going to sit in their chair with social distancing? You need to think about how the layout will look like, right? And plan that and prepare for that. Whether they are sitting in a circle, whether they are sitting in pairs, whichever arrangement that you think will suit the overall purpose of the plenary or the starter for its effective administration, you need to think about it and ensure that is in place. Okay. So because we said that it shouldn't happen just spontaneously, it has to be carefully thought out and carefully planned. And that's why we look at the planning considerations. The second thing here is the students, especially with a starter. If you are in an upper secondary school where students are moving from one lesson to the other, it is possible that a number of the students will come to your class late when they are transition from one lesson to the other, right? So
Or you
if you have
yourself
a,
might get even late sometimes
yes,
if you are
or
moving in the class.
the teacher, yes, yes. So if you're administering a starter, you need to think about that, especially the students that come late. Once you put the starter, we said is the first thing that has to be on the board, right?
Yeah.
If it's something that you're going to write it on the board, you write the question on the board. If you have printed and chopped it into small pieces, you distribute it quickly to the students available. Exploit the prime time. Don't let the students come and wait for you, copying so many things on the board. No, the starter is the first learning task you give them, right? To exploit that time where you'll be using for keep quiet, sit down, pick your notebooks, submit your homeworks. Don't use that time for that. Use it for a starter. So the starter exploits that. So you have to give, if you are giving the task to them on a sheet of paper, you quickly distribute to those who are available. And you have to think about those who will be coming late. That as they trick in, should have a plan of making sure that you get them on task. So either you stand at the gate, at the door of the classroom, and as the students come in, you quickly give them the sheet and tell them that they should solve this question quickly. Or if it is on the board, you are just at the entrance and you direct them that they should work on the task quickly. So that you within a short time will get the whole class settled and on task and preparing their responses to the question that a starter really is posing to them or the plenary. When they are exiting, they have to also be available quickly at the end of the lesson for the plenary. If it's supposed to be on the board, maybe midway in the lesson, you have actually written it on the board so that whilst the students are, the lesson is about ending, which we said 10 minutes devoted for that, you are really giving the students that time to reflect on their learning with that particular question. So with the plenary, it should be given to students as a warning. You don't wait till the end of the lesson and say, this is a plenary,
Okay.
right? So that's why I was saying that you can actually write midway in the lesson, you can write it on the board and ask the students that at the end of the lesson, that is the exit ticket that they are going to give you, that they are going to reflect on this particular question as far as their learning is concerned. So it doesn't happen at the end, it comes midway into the lesson. And also, if at the end of a learning objective, you are given a plenary, you need to give it way before the objective is achieved, before so that the students are aware of the plenary tasks and that they can engage in. And above all, the learning resources that you need in administering it, you need to think about it. So if you want a starter to be on the board, if you are going to project it, you need to know that you have a projector, a laptop, all set up, making sure that they are working way ahead of time before the students even show up. If you are going to give an oral question, that you have carefully written down the question or the task and that you are reading to the student, that means that you are aware that every student can write down the answer, the question correctly without any error or minimal levels of error. So you choose the resource that is available to you carefully and make sure that you are using it to good use in executing or administering the starter and the plenary activity. If you're going to have it on a piece of paper, it's printed out, it's cut for the number of students. Don't go there and you have 20 students and you have maybe 15 sheets for them. some students will not have a copy. So you need to have clearly an idea of the number of kids you have in your class. If you have to print a sheet and distribute it to them, you need to think through all of that so that that prime time of 5-10 minutes at the end and 5 in the beginning is actually being used by the students to really reflect on their learning and articulate their learning and get prepared for the main learning activity.
Okay, thank you very much, Kwesi, for that. It just clearly shows that if you are not an organized person yourself, you have a lot of issues having effective direct instruction, and you have a lot of issues using your starters and plenaries effectively. Because as you just said, you can have a situation whereby you know that there are 20 students in your class, you do not have the benefit of any technology for your use. And so if it is a question that you are going to give to your students and has to be written down on papers for them, then the paper, probably you need to make photocopies of that paper before you hit the classroom. And you know that time is of essence in everything you do in the class. If you are going to spend all your time writing the question on the board, and the students are going to sit, and then with your back facing them, you are spending your time writing on the board, that is recipe for disaster also as a teacher. And so I'm sure that other educators, the headmasters, the headmistresses in schools who are listening to us will also help the educators with the needed resources, the needed other options that can be made available to them, so that if it means making a photocopy of whatever the teacher has written down and then having the students have it and quickly use it. I know we have not mentioned the use of organizers, but I can clearly see that if I have an effective organizer and I use it in here for a starter activity, the student definitely, like the one you just shown, the Venn diagram, the student definitely will get a lot of engagement on all the lessons that are being done, and then time wastage can be curtailed or cut in there. All right, now let's do a quick recap of what we have done today. What in a nutshell are we saying we need to do as far as starters and plenaries are concerned for the benefit of anyone that is joining us late?
All right, so we've been saying that the starting and the ending of a lesson is critical for students' learning. The starting part of the lesson should be used for the students to connect their learning, either to what they already know or to what they are about to be exposed to in their current or new learning or lesson. And then at the end of the lesson, they should be given opportunity to articulate their learning, to understand themselves as learners through reflection, which we are talking about plenaries or the closure moment, where students are given tasks that gets them to think and to use what they have learned in a way that is meaningful and understandable to and relevant to them. Right. So these two moments are very important in directing and guiding students successfully in the main learning lesson to really master the concept that will be exposed to them within the context. So starters and plenary are very important for students' engagement. And we say that for them to be effective, they have to be engaged. They have to engage everyone, not just some. All the students have to be engaged in doing the tasks. They have to be on task. And that it should pace the lesson purposefully. And pacing is not just necessarily moving from one episode or activity in the lesson to the other, but moving the learning forward or the lesson forward purposefully. And the plenary and the starter are key in making sure that happens. And it should bring an element of challenge. The task should not be too easy, neither is it too hard. It has to follow the Bloom's taxonomy, having tasks that require remembering, comprehension, and application of what you know, as well as tasks that require analysis and evaluative thinking on the part of the learner. So if we have that good balance in the design of this starter plenary, Then we actually are preparing the students to really engage in meaningful learning within the main learning context, which is the learning, the lesson itself, the main lesson itself. So these are very important in preparing students for the learning and also giving them that opportunity to deeply reflect on their learning. And don't forget this, it says that we don't learn from our experience. We actually learn by reflecting on an experience, right? So the instruction that you just gave the student is an experience. And if you don't give them an opportunity to reflect on that learning will be forgotten, right? And that learning will not be remembered, and it will not be relevant to students. Neither will it give them that opportunity to think through about how they can use that learning in resolving meaningful problems and challenges that they face or that is around them.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. What you just did is what we call teacher summary, an example of a plenary, where the teacher takes his time at the end of the lesson to walk you through every key moment of that
Yeah.
lesson. And as you are doing that, if you are a student in that class, all you do is that at least note down the key moments. And as a student of this session, I also give an exit ticket, which will be what I have learned from the
Okay.
session and what I did not know prior to this. I did not know that if the set activities are not planned for and are not used purposefully, then it does not constitute a starter. Initially, my thought was that anything at all that I do at the beginning of a lesson is a starter. But then from this session, I've learned that it is not anything at all that I do. It are a set of things I plan for that I do as part of the teaching and learning moments, which then has to have a purpose to review whatever the students know prior to the lesson that makes it a starter. And therefore, when I have those things done, then I've also been able to quickly then use that as a starter. Thank you very much for your time. I am Kwadwo, and then on the other side is Kwesi. We want to continue to encourage you to share with other educators and then invite them to our platform to join us every Saturday as we continue our series on Effective Teaching and Learning Institute on the series of direct instruction that we're doing. And we hope to continue next week. Thank you all for your time, and thank you, Kwesi, for the wonderful session. Thank you and have a wonderful time. Bye-bye.